Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what are you going to do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Ms. Melissa Reed, the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have Judith Hawkins, former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. We have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. Last, we have with us Reverend Dr. Galen Carey, who's the Vice President of Government Relations for the National Association of Evangelicals. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our show. You know, the Freedom from Religion Foundation has recently reported that the South Carolina governor, Henry McMaster, has signed into law a bill to restore a private school voucher program that the state Supreme Court had recently done away with. In doing so, McMaster shows that South Carolina students are not, quote unquote, his priority. South Carolina's Constitution states plainly that public funds may not be used for the direct benefit of any religious or other private educational institution. This simple language seems to ensure that private religious interests will not erode any type of state public schools, and it protects the religious liberty rights of all South Carolina taxpayers. You know, when I take a look at this particular issue, and I'm wondering, how do we go about deciding whether or not you have gone too far, whether or not public funds have gone into a place where they should not have from a voucher program? I'm not really sure how do we get there. You know, Melissa, when you take a look at something along these lines and you realize that these are a lot of programs that we start seeing in many states across the country, but it seems as though in some states the language seems to be pretty clear, in other states it does not seem to be pretty clear. What do we have going on here in South Carolina?
Well, you're right, Orlin. We're seeing this across the nation, and we're seeing it in the big, beautiful bill that just passed through Congress, right? We saw for the first time funding or legislation that allowed for donations made to scholarship organizations, which would then in turn provide vouchers for students to attend private schools. So as you mentioned, the issue that South Carolina has been facing and the constitutionality issue is the direct funding, right, of private schools. And with good reason. I agree with that constitutional requirement. There's no oversight for private schools by the government, which there shouldn't be, right? But that said, so what we're seeing both in the state level here in South Carolina and on the federal level is this workaround. How do we bypass these federal restrictions? And what we're seeing is routing money through tax credits and independent scholarship organizations rather than the direct religious funding. So I'm concerned about that. As I said, I feel like private schools are private for a reason because they don't want the heavy hand of the government. You know, when I think particularly of the parochial school system that I participated in, my parents worked and really sacrificed to be able to send me to a Christian school because it was unique in what it was able to teach me, right? The instruction that was given. The federal government was not engaged in the oversight. So it'll be interesting to see both on the state level and the federal where this ends up as far as the constitutionality. But they're determined, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'll leave the constitutionality to all the lawyers here who know far more than I do. I think, so the school voucher system is difficult because often the rhetoric doesn't meet the reality. So we see this across the nation, right? The idea, which I like the idea of it, of, well, it's giving parents choice, right? That they can send their kids where they want to go and where they'll get a good education, and poor and underserved communities are. Every time we've seen this recently, in 2003, Arizona instituted their voucher system. 71% of those who used the voucher were in a private school the year before. In Arkansas, it was 95%. In Tennessee, we've expanded this, continue year after year. It's Nashville, Memphis, now Chattanooga, and it's going to be expanded. 84% of the schools who would get these vouchers, approved to get the vouchers, are religious schools, almost all of them Christian schools. There's both the aspect of this, as Melissa said, of if we're using state money, then there has to be some oversight of those private schools, particularly in terms of students with disabilities, of who actually gets in, of how that works. There has to be some regulation of this so that there's an equal playing field. But the other difficulty of this for me is the selling points for these voucher programs just don't meet reality and the facts to me. So if the actual discussion people want to have is, we're all paying taxes and can't send my kids to public school, so I want to use my public school money that I'm putting in for private schools, that used to be an argument. It was a losing argument, and so now we're just creating other avenues. So the legal aspects of this just become even muddier for me, because often what's said isn't what's being done, and it's hard to necessarily parse those out.
I wish that we would just call things what they are, call a spade a spade. If you want to send your child to a parochial school, you have the choice to do so. But with the choice comes the financial obligation. It's as plain as that. And you don't have the right to take from the state the funds that are public funds, because I don't care how you cut this, public funds are coming from people who do not want their children or their funds to be used for parochial schools. And there is no mixing of that. I think that should be a bright line. But then I don't get to make the decisions. I just gave you my opinion.
On the legal point, I think the key issue is government is not obligated or obliged to fund private schools. But if they do, then they can't discriminate against religious schools over secular private schools. And there have been cases, for example, in Maine where they tried to do that. So that's not right. I think in the bigger picture, let's face it, we don't have a world-class educational system, K through 12. We just don't. We don't measure up to most of our peer countries. And so is there space for innovation, and is there public interest in seeing a variety of options? I think an argument could be made that there is. Of course, how it's done in ways that make sure that there's adequate education available to everybody, that's, I think, where the rubber hits the road.
And I don't know how you're going to be able to do that. We only have so many tax dollars. And if you're using public funds to siphon off for people's choice, personal choice, that they want to send their children to private schools, religious or not, that to me cuts against public tax dollars.
Well, in many cases, though, public schools are actually spending more money per pupil than private schools, and sometimes with worse results. So if a private school could offer a better education at a cheaper price, why wouldn't that be of interest to the public as well?
Oh, that'd be fine with me, but I don't want them teaching religion there. I want it to still be a public school.
So private schools could be private. They could be secular or religious, and that's, I guess, a separate question. And we're also seeing, even in public schools, there are provisions being made in some places for religious education to be done. So I think there's kind of two separate issues. One, the quality of education in public versus private, and then the other, religious versus secular.
Yeah, I think Andy made a really good point when he was talking about sort of what the PR spin, as far as the need for this, is not aligning with what we're actually seeing in reality, as far as the opportunity to help those who are lower income, who just want a chance for a good education. And the benchmark, as far as, or the salary top for a household there, for a family of four, is more money than I make, as far as those that are eligible, right? I'm all for a higher quality of education and opportunities for those who are not in good public school systems, or, just products of all kinds of, whether environmental or familiar situations, to have opportunities. But let's be honest, and this is not what is coming to fruition when we've seen these implemented. It's most often, middle income students who are already, or families who are already sending their kids to private schools.
But Andy, how do we do away? I noticed you mentioned that the fact that these individuals will say, well, we're already paying taxes into the system for education. And if now some of that is actually funneling over to a private school or to a voucher program, what's the problem with that? Because just because I may be religious, that hasn't stopped me from having to pay my taxes. And if some of those tax dollars may go there, what's the downside of that argument?
Well, I think the downside is it's an explicit state sponsor of religion. Now that can get muddy, right? We have this of a playground, right? Well, a private school that has a playground. I don't think that's the same thing as saying, no. The idea of public education becomes, well, you pay out how much through your taxes, we're going to figure out how much that is, and then you can just take that where you go. Again, the idea that brings equal access and that high tide raises all boats is just not borne out by fact and reality. It just hasn't. I think charter schools are somewhere in the middle ground of this, of attempts, as Dr. Carey said, of trying to find some innovation. But the idea that, well, we're going to help underserved groups in our communities by giving them access to private schools, it doesn't happen. Yeah. Everywhere it's happened, private schools raise their tuition. It doesn't cost me $10,000 to send them there because I get an $8,000 voucher, but $2,000 may be a problem. And when the next year the tuition raises to $15,000, which it has in virtually every state that we've done this so far, that's the market. It just doesn't meet the reality.
Yeah.
It's seen in virtually every kind of aid program, Pell Grant's the same thing.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the issue, that whatever you see where any funds are going to be made available, the market already absorbs to it, right? And the next thing you know, pricing goes up. And so at the end of the day, the real question is, do we have a problem with the fact that you have parochial schools that may be utilizing this as a way just from a revenue stream boost that will usually end up happening once those programs are in place, which is what we normally see? Judge Hawkins, you kind of talked a little bit about that to say that this is probably moving in the wrong direction, and maybe what we're really doing is just really boosting more private education in ways that maybe they couldn't have afforded to survive without it.
I'm being real quiet on this topic because I think my opinions are probably biased and strong. But I'll put it in one sentence. If you want your child to go to a private school, you ought to pay for a private school. Period. That's it in a nutshell.
Well, and I think the way all of this is really flushing out is that we're trying to understand education as it relates to being done from a parochial school standpoint, and the funding that's being utilized to make this happen. Should it be more of a lean on the parents, or should it be more of a lean on wherever the funds can come from, including the possibility of government? There's a case out there that's called Dad's Place of Bryan, Ohio versus the city of Bryan. Not too long ago, there was a pastor by the name of Chris Avell, who's coming from an organization that's called Dad's Place, which is in Bryan, Ohio. They began operating what he calls their ministry as being 24 hours a day to serve the most vulnerable in his local community. For months, Dad's Place did so without any incident, but not that long ago, the city of Bryan actually sent him a cease and desist letter telling the church to stop allowing overnight guests, and if that didn't stop within 10 days, they were going to face criminal prosecution. And every day started to go by was going to even constitute an additional criminal offense that was going to take place. The church refused to comply, and the city ended up filing separate criminal charges totaling 18. Judge, when I take a look at a church that says that its primary function is to take care of those who are most vulnerable in a community, and in this particular area, in particular this situation, you have homeless people who are outside in frigid weather, and a church decides that it wants to take them in, somehow that becomes a violation of the law because maybe that local community thinks that they don't want to see this happening? Or is it a violation of the law because there's something in the betterment of the community to not help these individuals? What am I missing here?
Well, I'm going to try to summarize this case in 3 sentences. Number 1, this case should be decided it must be decided, I hope it is decided, on rational, objective facts, legal standards, not facts, legal standards. Number two, there seems to be an enormous amount of spinning of the facts. And number three, there needs to be clean hands on both sides. So if I were to summarize this case, I would put, when does doing good, what happens when doing good meets objective zoning laws? And so what seems to have happened in this case, quite simply, is that this church has opened up its doors and has allowed the homeless to come in. And it has taken the position, it appears, that their right to do good supersedes the city's obligations to keep the environment safe. Now, let me take a sidebar right there. If there's a fire at this church and homeless people are suffer a loss, okay, the city is going to be sued because the underlying, to the best that I can figure out, the underlying issue here is that the church does not provide adequate fire safety implementations. And the church is saying, well, they're not enforcing the rule equally across the board. But it seems like the facts are that other centers, other homeless centers, are meeting these objective standards for fire safety. And it bothers me that as I've been trying to follow this, and by the way, there's an excellent rebuttal, I'll call it a rebuttal, that the mayor wrote. And she says three courts have already agreed with the city. And so the church says it can't afford to put in the $50,000 sprinkler system. Well, my question is, since they have so much emotional support, why don't they do a fundraising project and ask the city to just help, not the city, but the people, including the Attorney General of the state of Ohio, who has kind of joined into this lawsuit, to give them the funds so that they can provide this? Because the bottom line of it is, this clean hands issue is it seems that the church is presenting itself as one way, but getting caught with his hands very dirty. And I'm really struggling with the case. And so I think that the fact finders are going to have to come down very clearly on what the facts of the case are. Is it, in fact, a real safety issue? Because who is going to pay when there is a disaster? And the city has liability if it does not enforce these safety factors. Now, if these safety factors are made up and they're trying to discriminate it against this church, so be it. But if, on the other hand, it is being equally enforced. And another thing, too, this church, according to the police records, again, I don't know if the facts have been spun, but according to the police records, the calls that they have out to this church for criminal activity is significantly higher than the calls they have at other similar situated homeless shelters. So when does doing good mean that you can just flaunt the law? I'll put it another way, in my humble opinion. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And I think in this case, Caesar should be honored based on what I know. But there you go.
Galen, what are your thoughts?
I think, to me, the most telling line in the mayor's letter that she put out is she said that we just care about the health and safety of our citizens, and so. But then when the city was asked, well, what should they do? They recommended, why don't you open at 8 a.m. and close at 10 p.m. So their solution is to turn everybody out of the building at 10 p.m. So in what universe does that better meet the health and safety needs of the residents than being allowed to stay in the churches? It's really hard for me to understand that. I think the other piece, in terms of the due process and all, as I understand, the city has exercised considerable discretion in its zoning application of its zoning laws, so that they can make exceptions here and there. And when if the courts have been clear about anything, so when the government makes exceptions, you can't discriminate against religious groups in those exceptions. You have to be handed It has to be applied even-handedly. And it looks to me, whether it's, I guess I personally doubt that it's a religious discrimination here so much as maybe a social, that, they just don't want, these homeless people right there in the downtown of their beautiful city. But nonetheless, it's pretty clear to me that a strict scrutiny standard here should apply. And on that basis, I can't see how the city should prevail.
I know I'm not supposed to respond, but I feel very strongly about this case because my research into it shows that we've got so much, I'm going to just use the word shenanigans. For instance, so they turn everybody out at 8, but one report says that there's no place for the people to sleep. And another report says that they bring out the mattresses and hide them under the table. I don't know what the true facts of this case are. And because of that, I think the fact finders are going to have to come down very strongly. And once we have a set of facts, then we can make a ruling. If you're going to serve the population, it still doesn't give you a pass not to make the place where you're serving them safe.
Sure.
And if you're having allegations of sexual abuse going on in the facility, is it being properly monitored? These are issues that somebody has to answer because they really impact whether you're trying to discriminate against the homeless because you don't want them downtown, or you really do have the health and safety of the citizens as your first criteria. And I'm quiet now. Thank you.
So, Erlen, this really is an issue of zoning, as we talked about. And, to be fair, there have been many situations of zoning issues specifically related to public houses of worship. We have a whole piece of federal legislation because there were so many challenges, right? The Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. So there are situations where churches or faith traditions are legitimately discriminated against or have been in the past, so much that there's now that legal recourse. That said, I believe that there is a sincere desire by the government of Bryan, Ohio, for the health and safety of their community. This is their professional responsibility, right? And so I don't think from my reading of things that there's any sort of malice. There's not a religious discrimination challenge going on here. There's not a bias against faith groups. I think it's just more of, is this an appropriate venue to respond to a very real need in the community, right? The frustration that I have is seeing these kind of cases, which again are important conversations, but labeling them inappropriately as a religious freedom issue, right? That the Dad's Place is saying that this is a violation of my constitutional rights to religious freedom, and then the attorneys from this gentleman saying that the church has a policy that they're not going to ask these people, the individuals, to leave unless, quote, there's biblically valid reasons to do so. Well, I would consider the safety with a stranger within your gates as a biblically valid reason, right? So I'm frustrated from sort of the way that this situation, which again is a very real need, responding to a very real need, is being portrayed. And I think the religious discrimination claim being misused.
Well, Andrew, when you see this and you see the possibility of it being misused, you've written about a lot of this type of stuff. And, how does a city handle something like this? Well, hopefully they're not shrouding something in the name of religion when it may just simply be a safety and ordinance issue.
Yeah, I mean, my answer would be better than this. This is, I will amen the confusion on the panel on this. Like oftentimes when these cases come, right, it is you look a little bit underneath and it is something of, well, there's a lot of homeless folks who are around this area because they're coming to the church, and that there's an increase in crime and there's coming. My understanding, this is a church across the street from the city's homeless shelter, right? So that idea of, well, we don't want them in this area is insane. So the question of, well, then, okay, we don't have a large enough area to house them, so this church is having it. I just don't know how we got to this point and some human didn't just say, hey, we all want the same thing. How do we do this? I mean, Judge Hawkins thinks of $50,000 for the thing to do. Well, then let's raise that money. if the government says, well, this isn't a dangerous place and we don't have, okay, well then try to expand the homeless shelter. Like if everyone is doing what they say they're trying to do, this lawsuit just doesn't happen. And so what are we doing here? Like at what point does an argument over the zoning become more important than what everyone says they care about, which is taking care of the vulnerable in this community? Whether you're religious or not, whether you go to that one church or not, everyone says this is what we care about, and their actions say not the thing we care about the most, seemingly. So I don't know.
I think you phrased it. It's not the thing we care about the most.
Yeah.
As I was reading it, I got the feeling that I'm having to choose we're out of time, so I can't choose my words as tactfully as I'd like, but I'm not, I smell a rat. Okay.
Well, I'll say this, Judge Hawkins. I think what we're trying to do here is to figure out how do you make sure that you're doing the right thing, following the law, but then allowing a little common sense to still take over. The idea you can always shroud anything in the law, and you can even shroud some things in religion. But at the end of the day, let's just try to do the right thing and focus on it in a way where it should be, hopefully for the betterment of all people. Hey, Galen, tell me something I don't know.
A typical city uses something like 20 or 21% of its land area for roads. In Calcutta, the percentage is 6%. So if you wonder why they have traffic jams, that's part of the issue.
Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that South Carolina produces more peaches than the state of Georgia, even though Georgia calls itself the peach state?
Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Oh, Melissa was born and bred in Georgia, and we are the peach state. I don't care how many peaches there are in South Carolina. That said, Bryan, Ohio, that we talked about, did you know, Orlin, that a record-setting speed run was set in Bryan, Ohio by a rail card, a speed that was 183 miles per hour. It's a record that still stands today. And it happened because the rail card was modified by a pair of jet engines.
Wow. Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, did you know that through medieval England back to Rome, and especially in Greece, ancient Greece, that the general consensus was that redheads were future vampires. They're pale and they have magic hair. And so, no exaggeration, often when redheads were buried, they were staked or tied to the ground to prevent them from rising and killing the children in the area.
No, Andrew, I did not know that. And I appreciate the knowledge you've passed on for today. Thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.